Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I'm going to be talking about a bunch of vehicles where the tier 10 tank has just been a disappointment, at least for me. And I'd like to clarify, this is obviously going to be my opinion, while I'll be basing it sometimes off stats and sometimes off just vehicles that match my playstyle, and that's a very important thing just because this is a list of tanks that I'm not too keen on and I kind of regret maybe moving my crew up to tier 10 or god forbid selling that tier 9 tank. And so that's what this video hopefully should be useful for a few of you. Any of you who are grinding up lines or thinking about lines that you're grinding up towards that tier 10 and you're thinking, should I keep the tier 9 tank or should I sell it to try and get my hands on the credits that I need to get that tier 10 vehicle? Well, hopefully that will answer a few of these questions. So my first example will be the AMX M451, this tier 9 French heavy tank. When I played it through recently, it's a fairly recent addition to the game, I think coming in just towards the end of last year, 2017. I had an absolute blast with this thing at tier 9, an absolute monster. Frontally its armor is very impressive, especially when you get up in a matchup like this. And its 120mm main armament is an absolute beast, it really is. It kind of feels a bit like a Conqueror, and while it doesn't quite have as much gun depression as a Conqueror, it's got 8 degrees rather than 10 degrees, its frontal hull armor and that lower plate just make it feel monstrous, and also its top speed limit of 40 kilometers an hour forwards really allow this thing to just get places. I just loved this thing at tier 9, and so, of course, when you love a tank, you end up making your way through a vehicle very quickly indeed, don't you? And so I got the tier 10 fairly quickly, I think, while it was still top of the tree. But, oh my word, regret. Nice blind kill there on the Sturmil, although it doesn't take a genius to figure out he was still there. I'm laughing because at the time I kind of was in my settings cancelling. I was trying to change some of the settings because I'm playing with a no crew skills, I think, whatsoever on this vehicle. I think even one of my crew members is at 90% or a 75% here because I was trying to save a little bit of gold, as you can clearly see by the view range that my vehicle has. But yes, when I got towards that tier 10 tank, oh my word, it was such a disappointment for me because pretty much everything kind of stays the same. The damage per minute stays the same. The hull armor just gets a little bit better. Mobility, pretty much the same as well. You just don't really have any big upgrades apart from the ability to use, I think it's a 130mm main armament, or I think it's like 128mm, something like that. It does 560 damage. It's got pretty good aim time and it snapshots like a boss. So I guess that's the only real reason to want to jump up to tier 10, to use a derpy gun which has worse penetration, much worse penetration on its premium rounds, worse DPM, worse aim time and everything than the tier 9, and I just wonder why you would bother to do it, really. And I think one of the big problems with the tier 10 version of this tank is that the Super Conqueror is in such a blooming good state right now, is that I'd far rather play this at tier 9. Sometimes I'd rather play this than the Conqueror actually at tier 9, but I would far rather play the Super Conqueror at tier 10 than playing in the AMX M454. So we've managed to push our way through the valley here, and although these Black Princes are dabbing the Tukey, and quite rightly so, if I was in a Black Prince shooting at the front of a tier 9 heavy, I would need all of the help that I could get my hands on. It doesn't look like it's actually managed to do anything for them, so even that, I think the Black Prince has about 250mm of penetration with its APCR rounds, but this thing's front is incredible. As we can see, they're just thinking they can shoot down on the upper plate there, or even on the lower plate. It hasn't worked out well for them. And this was very early on in 1.0 release, so maybe that AMX30 was having some problems with the new graphics. Now I put one shot into the AFK tank, and then obviously I'm going to try and focus my attention on the dangerous tier 9 auto-loading heavy tank. And how funny is it that my team are completely just ignoring it, shooting the AFK, and not dealing with the auto-loader that's right in front of me. So I was going, hey come on guys, can we not shoot the AFK tank? Can we shoot the auto-loading heavy tank before he manages to reload and finishes off? But luckily, he didn't manage to get any rounds into us, and so we finish off one of their tier 9 tanks and pick up our 5th kill of the game. And right now, this is just becoming a bit of a slaughter, really, and I'm getting very fortunate with how my shots are landing, showing you that sometimes you don't really need all of the crew skills to be able to contest those really big games right. And that's really what this tank does best. It just keeps plowing forwards, and the only real downside to the vehicle is that awful side armor, awful rear armor, and in a matchup like this, it does feel like I'm kind of just clubbing a few seals here, but You know what, if you're clubbing a few seals at tier 9, then you've got to do it right, huh? And 5,000 damage and 8 kills now with 5 tanks remaining on the enemy team. How many more are we going to be able to pick up? So, after this game finishes, I'm going to be talking through a whole list of other tier 10 tanks that I really don't think that's worth it. So why don't we start with China, for example? So China, let's take a look at the you know what? Firstly, immediately, tier 10 Chinese tank destroyer, not worth it. In my opinion, the tier 9 is better tier for tier. Stick with the tier 9. Okay, light tank wise, WZ1321, I think it's a thumbs up there. I would rather play the tier 10 than play the tier 9 tier for tier. Okay, 121 versus the WZ120. That's a bit of a tricky one. I'd probably rather go with the 121 just because you get a real big upgrade with that, the 122mm on that tank, and you also get extra gun depression as well, which really helps the vehicle. Okay, 111, 14, 111 5A, definitely the 5A. That 5A is an utter monster at tier 10, one of the best tier 10 vehicles in the game right now. 113 versus 14, yeah, I'd probably rather play the 113, another great vehicle there. Okay, so that's China done. Let's move on to the Czech tanks. Would I rather play the Skoda T50 or the TVP T50/51? You know what, I'd rather probably play the tier 10 tank, although I know that a lot of you will have watched a recent video on my channel where I had probably the best game ever in the Skoda T50, but that still isn't going to change my opinion. I think I would rather play the tier 10 TVP T50/51 just because you've got a bigger magazine. Next up, France. Foch versus Foch B. I'd rather play the Foch B. Having that big old magazine at tier 10 feels absolutely awesome. We've already talked about the AMX M451, definitely the better tank tier for tier in my opinion. I would far rather play the AMX 50B than the 5120 because the unload speed drops from 3.33 seconds down to 2.5 seconds, so you can get your shots out much faster and just feels so much more rewarding. I'd definitely rather play the tier 10 Bat Chatillon 25T as well, because that's probably the best light tank in the game. Even though I know it's a medium, it's just absolutely incredible for playing a reconnaissance and an assassin role. AMX 1390 versus AMX 13105, you know what, I'm split on that. Both are great vehicles, and I would say that probably the tier 9 is more competitive tier for tier than the tier 10. Okay, next up, AMX 30 Prototype versus AMX 30B. I would definitely rather play the AMX 30 Prototype. The upgrade to the 30B just doesn't feel impressive enough, plus you've got an awful cupola on top of the tank that you'll have to deal with. Now on to Germany, WTF Panzer IV versus Griller. You know what, I'm going to have to go for the Griller just for the bigger gun, although the WTF Panzer IV is very nice at tier 9. Jagdtiger versus Jagdpanzer E100. Oh my word, 50-50 here. That Jagdtiger, with I think the highest hit points at tier 9, is an utter damage per minute monster. But then when you jump up to tier 10, you get the second biggest gun in the game. Again, I think this is a split decision, but I do like to take my Jagdtiger out occasionally. Next up, VK4502B versus Panzer 7. Well, I detest the Panzer 7, even though it's a vehicle that I've managed to pick up a Kolobanov's medal in at tier 10. I think one of my only tanks that I've managed to get a Kolobanov's medal in at tier 10, but the VK4502B at tier 9 just feels so more dominant, and it doesn't have that awful side weakness that the Panzer 7 has. Next up, Moisian versus Mouse. Definitely the Mouse. It's just, it's kind of like the real Coke versus the Diet Coke version. If you can have it, you want to, right? E75 versus E100. Oh, this is terrible for me because this is my first tier 9 and my first tier 10 tank. Both great. I don't think I would rather play either of them at either tier. E50 versus E50M. Well, the gun doesn't really get any better apart from your premium rounds become your standard rounds and you get heat rounds as well. I think the E50 is far more powerful tier for tier at tier 9, but that doesn't mean that the E50M isn't hilarious to play at tier 10 with that increased traverse speed and engine power. Next up, Leopard Prototype versus Leopard 1. I would rather play the Leopard 1, even though the Prototype at tier 9 is still a good medium. RU251 versus Rheinmetall Panzerwagen. I would far rather play the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen because the RU251 to me is dead since they made the nerf to it when they bumped it up a tier. Next up, Japan. I would love to play the STB1, you know, it's flatter, it's just better in pretty much every regard, and it's worth the upgrade from tier 9 to tier 10. Type 5 Heavy versus Type 4 Heavy. You're just a noob at either tier if you play those tanks frequently. I'm sorry, it's how it is. They're an absolute blight on the game. I detest that high explosive mechanic. Okay, Stritzvang 103B, that is one of the easiest decisions ever. This is just so much better at tier 10 than tier 9. You've got armor, DPM, accuracy, absolutely everything is better. Totally worth playing at tier 10 rather than tier 9 there. Kranvang versus Emil? Oh, that's a tricky one. But I think I'm pushing towards the Kranvang just because it's an all-round holistic upgrade, and if you're gonna get into so many tier 10 games anyway, why not be in a tier 10 tank? Now on to the UK, Centurion 7-1 versus Action 10. Once again, I'd go with the Action 10. I just feel like it's a bigger, better tank at its tier. Tortoise versus Badger. Clearly the Tortoise. This thing has pretty much the same DPM, but I'd say kind of better armor now, especially when you can meet tier 7 opponents, right? And I love the 120mm on this tank because the rate of fire, I think it's 8.45 rounds a minute, allows me to track my opponent, lock them in place, and keep them tracked before they manage to repair it, unlike the larger caliber gun on the Badger, which is nicer for trading, but so awkward when you want to keep your opponents tracked. Next up, Conqueror versus Super Conqueror. I believe both great tanks at their tier. I would rather play the Super Conqueror, however, with that big old step up in damage per minute and everything else about the armor as well. Conway versus FV4005. Definitely I'd rather play the FV4005. That's an utter monster at tier 10, and the Hesh rounds, those 1,750 filthy Hesh rounds, are more than enough reason to play it. Now on to America. What are we looking at here? Sheridan versus T49. Oh, I'm split. Because obviously the T4... Do you know what? I would rather play the T49 with the derp gun, because there are more tanks at lower tier, I feel, that you can actually make that work with, and sometimes they're a little less snapshotty. But I'd rather play the Sheridan with the 105mm. But then again, the T49 has a nice 90. Tough decision. I think it's a split there. T54E1 versus T57 Heavy. Oh, easy win for the T57 Heavy. You get monster DPM, you've got more armor, just more everything. T30 versus T124. I would rather play the T30 because the E4 just doesn't really feel like that much of an upgrade apart from penetration and some of the cheek armor, I guess, or probably the frontal hull. But now you don't have a fully traversable turret, you've got a horrible weak point on top of the tank, especially against premium rounds, and I think the T30 can just be so much more dominant in a game at tier 9 than the E4. Next up, T95 versus T123. Oh, that's a real tough decision. I would personally rather go with the T95, even though the E3 is an utter monster in the right scenario, just because it's the T95 and it's hilarious. Next up, M46 Patton versus M48 Patton. Well, the M46 is a beast at tier 9. 6.66 rounds a minute, rate of fire, and now it's got turret armor to boot, as well as some decent view range. That can do everything. But the M48 just has that I don't give a monkey's hull armor, which can keep you in the game for long enough to just go to town on your opponents, and it snapshots like a boss. And finally for America, M103 versus T125. Frankly, I feel these are two tanks that, well, they're not terrible, have really fallen out of favor in the meta, and there are now both French and British heavy tanks that I would rather play. And finally, let's take a look at the Soviet vehicles. Object 704 versus 268. And that, again, tricky. The 704 is a real powerhouse at tier 9, but the 268 gets a real big upgrade over it. But I'd say all in all, the 704 is the better tank tier for tier. Next up, 268 version 4 versus 263. Well, this is a no-brainer. I think the Object 263 version 4 is the best tier 10 tank in the game right now, with an incredibly low skill cap for the impact that it has. Next up, T100 LT versus T54 Lightweight. Easy game for the T100 LT, the best tier 10 scout, an incredible tank, and one of my favorites to play. I can't even imagine wanting to play a T54 Lightweight ever again. Now, T54 versus T62A. I'd rather play the T54, I think, at tier 9. But T54 versus Object 140, I just think it's different enough to want me to play the 140. But again, this is taking into account that I'd probably rather play the 140 and the 430U than play the 140 and the T62A, or play the T62A and the 430U, if that makes sense. If I could only have two tanks just because of the playstyles of the T62A and the 430U being so similar. And would I rather play the 430 or the 430U? Well, it's got to be the 430U, just for the alpha damage increase, the armor increase, even though the Object 430 at tier 9 is no slouch. Next up, a tank which I've only played on a test server, so I guess this is going to be my weaker opinion. Object 705A versus Object 705. Well, I've been really enjoying the tier 9 tank. It can snapshot with its APCR rounds at long range against moving targets, and it can still side scrape. but my opinion will have to wait until I actually have the tier 10 tank on that one. Next up, IS-7 versus Object 257. I would rather play the IS-7. Since they've buffed the mobility of that vehicle, it's an utter god at tier 10 if it can manage to hide its beak and people don't fire premium rounds at you. It's especially good in a good matchup where its lack of DPM doesn't matter against lower tiered opponents. And finally, ST1 versus IS4. I would rather play the ST1 at tier 9 than the IS4, because your armor is pretty much the same, but you're a whole tier better and you can deal with far more tier 8 and even tier 7 opponents. And for anyone who cared about that AMX M4 MLE51 game that we had, this was a pools medal for that 10th kill we secured there, a steel wall for bouncing 1470. Wow, that's a very low damage steel wall, I guess, from the Black Princes. High caliber for that 7000 damage dealt in 6 minutes, and 1,734 base experience points, which isn't too bad for tier 9 and doesn't look like we fired that many premium rounds here, so 52,000 credits profit. Not too bad. The perfect example of why I think that there are quite a few tier 9 tanks that are just worth keeping, or even just not bothering to get the tier 10 because their playstyle is more fun for me, at least tier for tier. And I hope this video was useful to you. Maybe it was just a bit of a funny idea I had, and I hope that you ladies and gentlemen enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up, but if you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And if you've got any other ideas for me to compare, then let me know in the comments and maybe I'll make your an idea a reality on this channel. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.